Compañeros, welcome to the SQL Data Partners podcast, the podcast dedicated to SQL Server-related topics, which is designed to help you become familiar with what's out there, how you might use those features, or ideas on how you might apply them in your environments. I am Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am Steve Stedman. We are two data professionals trying to help others get a better handle on their database environments, either through this podcast, our training, or our consulting practice. Thanks for joining us on the SQL Trail. Welcome to the show.
SQL Data Partners.
Compañeros, welcome back to the SQL Trail. This is episode 124. Today we're talking with Greg Moore. He's the owner of Green Mountain Software. He's the owner of Green Mountain Software and the author of the book IT Disaster Response: Lessons Learned from the Field. And ultimately, that is the topic of our conversation today, is this idea of getting beyond the runbook. So in a disaster, how we can better coordinate with one another, not so much in simply just the execution of the response. And so we're excited to have him. Greg is up from the northeast portion of the United States and works with cave rescue teams. And so we're interested in talking with him about some of his experiences. We do have a few compañeros shout-outs we want to get to. The first, John Workman, reached out on LinkedIn. He just took a job with Microsoft, helping folks on board with the various services that are there, and wanted to reach out. I think we're going to try to get John on the program here to talk about some of the things that he's doing. Also, I'm not sure if we have any Potable listeners here, but if you're getting your podcast through Potable, welcome. Welcome to the SQL Trail. We're glad to have you. I want to give a quick shout out to Dave Mason from the Panhandle of Florida, reaching out saying hello. Dave and I were talking about a few ideas for the podcast as well, and I think I'm going to snag him here later on for episode as well. Now, Christian Satnick, he suggested a topic, although I couldn't convince him to come on, but he suggested a topic, wanted to talk about continuous delivery to the database. And so, Christian, I'm happy to say that episode has been recorded and will be out next month. And so we're looking forward to that. I also want to give a shout out to Steve Stedman. So unfortunately, through work and busy lives, right, that we lead, Steve is no longer going to be able to be on the podcast with us. And that's a big blow, I know, to all you listeners. I've enjoyed having Steve on the program for, these 50 plus episodes and appreciate all his contributions to the program. It's not to say that he won't be back, but unfortunately he won't be a regular guest. Now, he is going to join us for today's conversation. And there's one other episode that he'll be with us. And then, moving forward, you will probably see a variety of other folks that are panels, if you will, that we'll be doing on the program to try to get a few more people there in as part of the conversation. But I wanted to thank Steve again for all of his time and effort, because it does take quite a bit of time to do that many episodes. And so I'm appreciative to him. So now I think it's time for a little SQL Server in the news. I want to give a shout out to some of my friends at Channel Advisor. I think there are a couple of others, but those folks, Tracy, Mark, and Brian, have put together a website called We Speak Linux at wespeaklinux.com, surprisingly. And this website is directed to Windows administrators and developers who want to learn about Linux. And the reality is, I think most of them are coming from that DBA background, and they want to help others who are going to be in dual environments, which Channel Advisor is, and running SQL Server in multiple operating systems and some of the challenges that they're going to face. I'm not sure if they've started yet, but I know that they are going to be starting in March. The first week in every month, they're going to have a webcast, invite folks to come on, ask questions. And so there'll be more content. They are just kind of getting the site up, but there'll be continue to be blog posts and whatnot around that. So if you are interested in finding out a little bit more about running SQL Server in Linux, then that site might be for you. So our URL for today's episode is going to be sqldatapartners.com/caving or sqldatapartners.com/124. And let's go ahead and jump into the conversation with Greg. So Greg, organizations and how
It's great to have you.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the program today. We don't get too many authors on the program, and so it's nice to see that you've put out a book there, and we're going to obviously be focusing on that a bit today. And so our topic is how IT folks can learn maybe from some of the other systems or other organizations and how they respond to disasters. And I think this idea of kind of beyond the run book, right? So, as IT people, right, we know, hey, we have to have a run book, and that's going to tell me what I need to do.
Yep.
But for those of us who have actually had a disaster, we know that it doesn't always work quite as smoothly. And so you actually give a couple of examples or scenarios, and we thought we might chat about those and then apply them. How do we apply them to IT?
Sounds good to me. Where do you want to start?
We have a caving example, and then we have a plane crash example. Yes, that's right. And start with.
Let's start with caving. And as folks can probably tell, I have this fascination with when things go wrong. So I kind of pick the highlights and the lowlights there, I suppose.
Yes, that's right. And so another fascinating, what I find really interesting about this, at least from your book, I'm not sure if this is still the case, but at one time you were actually the database administrator for one of the caving teams, like there's this group of people who would actually do rescues.
I still am the database administrator. It's the National Cave Rescue Commission. We're not a rescue team. We actually train folks who form the rescue teams. I'm also an instructor, so I like to tell people where to go underground and what to do when they get there.
All right.
Okay. Yeah, so I thought that was an interesting mix of professional and personal interests colliding there.
Yep.
So in the book, you tell the story. In the middle of the night, you get called in. There's a caver in a cave who's been free climbing, and they've been injured.
Yes.
And your goal is to go in and help them get out.
Yep. One of the mantras that we try to teach is get people out as quickly and safely as we can, and hopefully in better shape than we found them. And he unfortunately was not in great shape after falling about 40 feet.
Oosh.
Yeah, it was not a pretty scene, but by the time I got there, actually a lot of the rescue had taken place and there were quite a few other folks there. So I was just one cog in the overall machine.
Okay. Now, one of the challenges in this specific instance was that, as with, if you've never done caving before, if you've been on a tour, it's not the same thing as some of these, these cave exploring. The holes are very small, right? So you go on a tour, everything's very big. It's, I won't say caving is unsafe. You have to, crawl around a bit. I've been caving here in Virginia. And there's actually instances where you have to you're on your belly almost trying to get through some of these places. And so that kind of lends itself to this story. And so that kind of lends itself to this story in the sense that he was not in a big open space and you could just, get the stretcher down there and roll him on out.
You're very right. I always love in movies where they walk through caves, there's plenty of light and the floor is nice and smooth and everything like that. Especially in New York, our caves don't tend to have any of those features. Crawling is a big part of it. This particular cave in Vermont is much like that. The entrance is kind of a top of basically about a 50-foot drop. And straight down from there is actually a large room. So where the unfortunate patient had landed was actually quite a large room, and there was room to work there. But to tie this back to IT, the cavers in the area had recognized that something could go wrong here. And they had done some measurements, and they knew at the top of that drop, to get a patient through in a litter was not going to work. It was basically, chest size normally. You put them in a litter, it's not going to work. So they had actually had a pre-plan, kind of think of as our run book, that basically said, hey, if we ever have to evacuate a patient from beyond this point, we need to get in here and remove some rock.
Wow.
So they actually had spent about 2 to 4 hours removing that rock there and setting up some other stuff, which is why by the time I got there, it was about a 2-hour drive. I kind of got there into the middle of the rescue because the local rescuers had already there. It was about a 2-hour drive. I kind of got there into the middle of the rescue because the local rescuers had already done a lot of the pre-plan. Yeah. But, as they say in the military, which is the quote, something along the lines of no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy.
Right.
That was a situation here. We had great plan. We got him to the top of that drop, but then getting him out through that trapezoid shape, we realized very quickly that, the plan isn't going to work. and it's 40 feet long, so we can't remove 40 feet of rock. We've got to come up with plan B. Or, so I like to say in the back of my head, I'm thinking plan B, C, D, and E and trying to figure out what's going to work.
Right.
So with that then, I mean, with a 40-foot fall, I mean, someone could have pretty significant injuries. And
Correct.
To just try and drag them out without being on a stretcher or a basket of some kind could do much more damage than the fall
From this back,
because of the size of the stretcher and the patient themselves. So what did you do at that point then?
Steve, you bring up a great point. And again, since, this is more of a database podcast than a cave rescue podcast, let me tie some of this back. One of my fellow rescuers who got to the patient recognized the injuries, had some basic first aid training, a little beyond that, and was able to stabilize the patient, including putting a little traction on one of his legs, which immediately calmed the patient down. As you can imagine, having broken legs was a likely result of this and not a comfortable position.
Right.
But as I mentioned, we had to clear rock out. And, one of the first rules we have is make sure we don't make things worse.
Right.
And it's kind of the same thing in say, a database failed or something like that. Sometimes the temptation is, let's reboot the server. Let's do this. I've had a boss come in and say, let's do this, and make things worse because they didn't stop to think, hey, sometimes the temptation is, let's reboot the server. Let's do this. I've had a boss come in and say, let's do this, and make things worse because they didn't stop to think, hey, what's the situation? How can we stabilize things, make them better? In this case, it was, let's move the patient out of the way of the falling rock. Let's get the patient into a litter. For those who are EMS geeks, we tend to use the big red or orange Furno litters. Let's make the patient comfortable. They're going to be there for a while. Let's give them some food and water and wrap them up. So we spend a lot of effort stabilizing the patient. So we have one team kind of doing that while we have the other team putting in the ropes, opening up the rock, things like that. And it's one of the things that I've seen in what I call kind of the larger IT disasters, a failure sometimes where there isn't a whole lot of thinking beyond the immediate problem. There's this has crashed. We need to focus on this. But someone's got to be thinking about, who's have a team focusing on that while we have the team focusing on the dead database. Or in this case, team focusing on the patient and a team focusing on the rock fall.
Yep. As you say that, I'm thinking back to an example I worked on last week with a corrupt database and with the whole concept of don't make things worse. And I think that when people run into database corruption, one of the first things they do is they try and reboot the server to see if that'll fix it. And that never fixes it. And in fact, sometimes it makes it worse. But the one that I was working on, it was actually, if they had rebooted it, the condition the database was in, it would not have come back up. So that was one of them. We got lucky that they followed that same logic, like you were talking about there. Don't make it worse. And they didn't do the reboot. They just left it running until somebody could look at it. And I think that so many of these things you're talking about here, I mean, really translate over from rescue world to dealing with database issues or IT crises.
Exactly. And then, the other problem that we run into, and I started to mention this too, is, like I say, so we get the patient up and we try to get them out through the entrance and realize, our initial plan is not going to work. And this is where, because I knew several members of the rescue team, I'd worked with them previously, or I had trained with them. I actually had given instruction to a couple of them. And I also had with me an expert rigger inside the cave and one outside the cave. And I basically came up with a plan. I yelled at them, said, hey, come close so I can tell you, this is what I need. And then I stepped back and let them make it happen. And it's something I've seen again in IT. My best managers during a disaster have been the ones who know what help to offer and what help to, step back. I joke, but it's a true story. Back in, I'd say it was probably about 2000 when, we're still young and we were all not as jaded and gray-haired as we are now. That I don't remember what was on. Our website was suffering performance issues or something. And the CEO of the company, who was also a good friend of mine, he came in, looked at us, realized that we knew what we were doing. And he said, I probably can't help you, but can I order you some pizza? And it sounds like a small thing, but it really was a big thing because, we were going to be there for another hour or two at least. It was close to dinner time. And, we're all focusing on the problem, but in the back of our mind, we're all kind of thinking, hey, I'm kind of hungry here. So as a manager, he recognized his limitation. He wasn't going to sit down and start typing out SQL commands or anything like that, but he could remove the small issues, and he could, keep all the salespeople from bugging us every 5 minutes. When's the site up? When's the site up? So he worked very well in that role as let the people who can solve the problem solve the problem. Back to the cave rescue here. That was my attitude was these two, they know what I want. I trust their rigging. If they can't make it happen, they'll let me know. And when they do make it happen, we'll go ahead and try it. And it worked very well. And that's why I said, I don't want to take credit for it. It might have been my idea. Let's try this rope this way. But these guys did all the hard work. And in a disaster, knowing that you can trust your team, you can trust the people below you or alongside you is a big part of that. And I'm going to guess, Steve, as an EMT, you probably have that where, you work with certain partners where you just know that, you get to the patient, you're zoned in and you just know what to do without having to shoot 100 questions back and forth.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, the thing I see oftentimes from flipping that around on the IT side is you get that IT manager who doesn't have the knowledge or the confidence in the team. And their solution of dealing with issues is to come in and sit next to or stand next to the people who are doing the most critical work and
company
every single step that they're doing. And instead of ordering pizza, like you in your example, where that actually can make things much worse or slow things down, either in the rescue situation or in the IT side of things.
Exactly. And I think we've all had that. I know I've had that. I've actually it was a brand new VP to the company, basically coming to my office and, whoa, what were you doing? And give me a hard time. I basically, while you were, asking 1,000 questions, I was solving the problem. It was almost a career limiting event at that point, but it's kind of what he needed to set in his place. And I would not recommend doing that to most managers. But again, the most successful managers I've had have been the ones who, will back off and say, they'll ask the pertinent questions. Hey, do you have an ETA so I can get out an email? Okay, that's 30 minutes. Great. I'll check back with you in 31 minutes. But yeah, the ones who hover over you and stand over your shoulder while you're trying to get stuff done, they realize that half the time they're going to make things take 3 times as long. Right.
And they'll even add the risk of more mistakes being made, because I know I seem to make more mistakes when somebody's looking directly over my shoulder, and I'm more concerned about, well, what's their next question going to be than what it is you're doing on the system, perhaps.
You actually don't care.
Oh, sure. And of course, there's a rule that the more people standing over the shoulder, the harder it is to type regardless. So, and if the
Absolutely.
your fingers aren't going to find the keyboard.
Yeah. And I think some of this ultimately kind of comes back to culture as well. Right. And, if we're not working with our teams, and we tend to be very siloed, right? When we do get into this situation where we have to, it's all hands on deck kind of situation, if that's not a culture that we've developed, then I think it does make it very challenging. And, and I think maybe in the manager's defense, right? Perhaps very challenging. And, and I think maybe in the manager's defense, right? Perhaps is that if the teams are not reaching out to them, and it takes two, right? So I'm not singling anybody out here necessarily, right? But if we're not reaching out and trying to have those conversations and work together to solve those problems, then when it becomes, super important, the pressure of that doesn't make for a great combination.
Agreed.
Yeah. So one thing I'm really curious about there in your caving example is that, and I see this on the EMS side quite a bit as well as in IT, is that it really comes back a lot to training. And there's things that are sort of the common things that could happen. And those are the things that you train for quite a bit. And then there's also high risk things that can happen, but maybe they're less frequent. And that's a scenario where it's something you've trained for, and you've seen it lots of times, or you've trained for it lots of times, it makes it much easier to deal with. But then when you get in a situation where it is way different than anything you've trained for, or there's some twist that really changes it up, that's where I think mistakes end up being made. And I guess I'm curious if you've seen that same thing in your background.
Yeah, I definitely would agree. And this is one area where I think what I'm going to call street EMS versus backcountry EMS or rescue differs a bit. Street EMS, like you say, a lot of it is pretty standard calls, broken limb, broken that, and everything like that. And then, like you say, you get the very out of the ordinary ones. With cave rescue, there's I don't want to say magazine, something that comes out about every 2 years called the American Cave Accident Report. It's put out by the NSS that basically covers all the reported cave accidents. And one of the goals is to say, here's the commonality, here's the things. But one of the things that strikes me is generally, while there's often a lot of, similar injuries, and a lot of them are honestly self-rescue, person twists an ankle and their friends help them out or something like that. When actual calls come out, every cave is unique. It's really kind of hard to develop, standardized plans. So what I really try to teach, and I'd say the NCRC, the Cave Rescue Commission I work with, tries to teach is, here's a set of skills, here's a set of tools to put in your toolbox, and keep them in mind because you may never know which one you're going to need. And that's a big part of it. This one rescue up in Vermont, it was a lot of putting little pieces together of, hey, this will work here, this will work there. But there was obviously nothing we could train for this particular, do that, unless you're training on a particular cave, which, some teams might do because they know that cave is popular. But
okay,
in terms of making mistakes, you're right. And again, it goes back to something I was taught decades ago, literally, was kind of a joke, but not entirely, was in the backcountry, when something bad really happens, first thing you should do is sit down and make yourself a cup of tea. And it sounds kind of like, oh my God, they're going to, well, unless they're going to bleed out in the next 5 minutes, which case, take care of that. If it's 12 hours to a rescue, making that cup of tea is going to force you to slow down and stop and think about what's going on. And, one thing that we all get caught up in is what is, the term go fever. We've got to go, go, go. Well, sometimes we need to slow. And it's a hard thing to really do. And I think especially with the more critical, larger disasters is the ones where we most often have to slow down and stop. To use an analogy, see, if you ever done like mass casualty incidents, they always say the person who's screaming in pain is probably not the problem.
Right.
Hey, they got an airway, everything like that. It's that person sitting quietly that you've got to think about what's going on with them. Why are they not making any noise? And again, so we have to slow down and do that slow and stop and think about it and take that extra 5-10 seconds to evaluate before we jump in.
Yeah. What's interesting about that is that there's a term that we use oftentimes in EMS, which is called a distracting injury or a distracting patient, where it's something that jumps out as sort of obvious and big, but it hides the real issue. For instance, it might be a broken leg when somebody's really having a cardiac issue.
Yeah.
And people will tend to focus on the obvious thing, sort of, and sometimes overlook the more serious things. And I think that happens quite a bit in the database world as well, because you'll see one thing and you'll immediately start dealing with that one distracting issue and not realize that you've got a file system failure or something more significant on your database that is really causing all of it, and not just causing the distraction.
That you bring up a great example. I just dealing with a client of mine where, oh my God, our backup's filled up our disk space. What went wrong? It's like, okay, we can clean up a few of the backups. No, I'm not going to reduce your retention rate because you really need to have this many days worth just in case. But maybe we should look into why for 3 days in a row, your backup that normally takes 1 hour took 5 hours. You're worried about the disk space. Well, that's a symptom of the fact that something went wrong with your file system, that your backups now are taking 5 times longer.
Yep.
Yeah, I also think that kind of going back to maybe the differences in caves and whatnot. So standards, if we're going to apply that, to an IT environment, so standards might play a role here. And everybody does things a little bit differently. And I think one of the challenges that we as IT people have is that we tend to think that our way is the best way.
Well, of course, my way is the best, but that's besides the point of this discussion.
Yeah, and when again, kind of coming back and saying, okay, well, again, do we have any processes that maybe going back to that run book, right? Like, how is it that we're supposed to be tackling some of these things?
Yep. I'm a huge fan of people learning the how and the why behind things, not just what to do in X, but why are we doing X? Why are we doing Y?
Right.
Bringing back again with CZMS, a lot of it is, why is the patient why we can do a better job of it.
Yep.
And same thing with databases, why is this happening, or why do I back up the tail of the log? Well, because it's useful, not just, let me hit a button because the commercial software says to do that.
Right.
Yeah. And that's interesting because I often say that why is perhaps the most important question you can ask. And I'll get this working with clients where somebody will ask for something and I'll come back and ask, well, why do you want to do that? Or why are you asking for this? Because they just said, do this without any detail around it. And sometimes when you really understand that why, it changes how you approach it or how you're going to deal with things.
Yep.
So my question I want to bring up, right? So we've talked about preparation, right? How different might things be, training. Now, again, I think for a lot of people, getting the run book would be a huge win, right?
Yes.
And would be a huge win, right?
Yes.
And like, yep. Hey, we're done, right? I'm finished. But what are your thoughts around kind of take that to the next step? And, how can we be better? I don't know, is prepared the right word for working together? Yeah.
I think one of the things that companies are afraid to do sometimes is practice. Mm-hmm. One of my former employers had a very good setup, very robust network architecture and everything like that. And my network engineer came to me one day and said, hey, I'd really like to do a failover of our switches just to make sure it works and everything. Mm-hmm. I said, yeah, that's a great idea. What's the risk? Everything like that. And he wrote it all up. And it was something like, maybe worst case, 30 seconds to rehome the BGP tables and all that. And we would do this at like 4 a.m. So I went to my managers and one of the other managers and like, oh, no, we can't do that. It's too risky. And what I couldn't get through to them, and my network engineer felt the same way, was it can't be too risky. We either trust the setup and prove it, or we don't, in which case we can't rely on it in an emergency. And I think in my book, and I mentioned in one of my talks, supposedly Jeff Bezos would walk through his data centers and just randomly pull out a network cable or a hard drive. And, I say that to people and they get this look and they're like, oh my God, I could never do that. And I ask them, how do you know your DR scenario is robust enough to handle that? If you have a SAN and it's supposed to handle a drive down, how do you know it's going to do that until you actually pull a drive? Now, that said, I'm not quite that extreme of just randomly walking and pull out hard drives because, you might want to check first that you don't already have a failed hard drive.
Yeah, there is that.
Right. But, practice really is an important part of it.
Yeah, so from that perspective, right? Because one of the things that the problems you have, and there have been plenty of examples, I think. So what was it, Delta that had the big downtime? They were trying to switch their power supply, right? And they're like, okay, well, this is a test, right? Let's switch from one to the other, and then it failed, and then so the practice caused an outage, right? And so there's that fear, right? Which I think is real. Part of that is because you already have all this infrastructure we talked about testing is already in a production state, right? Users are depending on it. Somebody is depending on it. It can get complicated. I'm not saying you could necessarily recreate your entire scenario, your entire production environment. Obviously, that'd be nice. But, routers and switches and things, that gets expensive, right? But what about maybe trying that in in another environment? Okay, yeah, maybe I don't have all the users on there, but can I at least attempt on this, these two VMs, right? And go from this one to that one. Okay, well, at least I know I can do that, right?
No, I think that's a brilliant question and a brilliant point. Again, what's it worth to you? If you're doing mission critical systems, say Wall Street, where they're literally trading hundreds of millions of dollars a minute, right, then investing in basically a duplicate infrastructure is probably worth it.
Right.
If you're doing $1,000 an hour of business, well, yeah, you probably can't duplicate your entire data center. But like you say, these days, you can pretty much virtualize anything in your environment. And taking the time to do that. But I'm going to go back to your Delta comment for a minute and say, consider this. In a proper test and everything, you have people in the key places that, oh, yeah, normally software would do this, but we'll have someone in there that they can manually type in the command if need be or something like that. So imagine that the Delta scenario was not a test, but had happened for real, that for whatever reason, the power had failed and they didn't have any of their preparation in place. I'm assuming that they had a plan in place of, okay, if something goes wrong, we'll fall back. Again, think about if it happens in real and I don't have anything in place, it's probably going to be worse than if I do it in practice and something does go sideways.
Oh, yeah. And I think that whatever outage you cause when you're doing a practice like that is going to be less significant than when it happens in reality if you had not practiced for it. And yeah, I mean, if you cause an hour of downtime because of a practice, that might prevent 12 hours of downtime in reality. So and that's one of those that I think it's oftentimes hard to get management to approve.
No, I agree.
Very
I
hard.
agree.
He asked that question. Very
I
hard.
agree.
Because oftentimes it's running right now, and if you touch anything, it's your fault when it breaks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm reminded, I'm just finished teaching my son to drive. He's got his license now. And, growing up in the Northeast, we get snowstorms. So one of the first things that we did last winter actually was took him over to the local parking lot with big snowbanks. Said, okay, let's do some skids. Let's do some slides. And, he asked that question. Well, Dad, what if I slide in a snowbank or there's like 2 light poles in the middle of the parking lot? What if I hit that? And I had to point out to him is I'd much rather have you do that at 5-10 miles an hour in the parking lot than, on a highway for real where there's other cars and people around.
Sure.
I mean, yeah, I'll be upset if my car gets a dent in it, but that's a far cry from if you've never practiced it for real and go into, a real skid on a real curve with other people's in the car and stuff like that.
So what do you think, I guess maybe last question here, and then we'll move into SQL family, but so for the non-managers, for managers, I'm not saying it's easier, right? But ultimately you have a little more decision-making authority, right? So how could we, as the humble IT worker that we are, right? How could we begin to influence some of those things?
How can we manage our managers? I would do 2 things. I would honestly try to read up a little more on the Incident Command System, ICS, and then on cockpit resource management or crew resource management, which deals with how management, both in terms of structure and then in terms of communications, can work during a disaster scenario. ICS was developed to handle everything from a car accident up to wildfires in California. And while I honestly would love every IT accident up to wildfires in California. And while I honestly would love every IT manager and maybe one step above that to take at least a 100 level ICS course, which, by the way, you can go to the FEMA website and click through the whole thing in about half an hour. Maybe us IT folks can convince our manager to, take that class once and let me do a little more research on this so I learn more and, how to be part of a team and then how to be able to communicate up and down and across my team.
Yep. Oh, yeah. I would completely agree with that. I mean, if IT management could learn ICS, it would make disaster response much more organized, I think.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess I'll leave maybe another word. I remember, so one time I was at church and an older gentleman, right, is in the pew and he appears to be, so there's something wrong with him. He slumps over, right? I was surprised. So people around him were like, oh gosh, what's going on? And they didn't immediately move him. Obviously they call the paramedics, right? And the paramedics come over, they get him out. And what was interesting, I did not see this. I was saying this, seeing this for secondhand or hearing this secondhand, was that we were all concerned, right? Like, oh my gosh, do something. And what the EMT did, he came over, right? Again, he hears this call, hey, guys, stop breathing. It's older gentleman, 80 years old, might be having a heart attack. And at that time, he was alert. And the EMT walks over to him and just starts talking to him. Hey, what's your name? Right? I'm whatever, right? And they thought, like, wait a second, like, are you supposed to be doing something? But again, I think through that training, like he wanted to establish, like, where am I, right, in the process.
He's assessing the situation, everything like that, and that's a big part of it.
Right.
One last thing with
Right.
One last thing with cave rescue, we tell folks, and we drill this into our students. When you come across a scene, the first thing you do is stop and look around and see what happened. Why did that person fall down? What, you don't want to, if it's bad air in the cave, which is actually very rare, but you don't want to go charging in after somebody and find out that, it's bad air.
And then you're down there as well.
So yeah,
right?
So it really is often just sometimes the simple things of, hey, let me just ask a few questions. And, patients 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you everything you need to know. You just have to be able to listen. And, with databases, can't quite ask them questions in terms of English. But if you're willing to take the time and look at the logs and spend an extra couple of minutes looking at stuff, it'll answer most of your questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because so often when there's a problem, whether it's in EMS or in a database, people get tunnel vision and they just think about it's being reported, but they don't ask the questions like that to either from the patient or from a database to understand what the real issues are. I think, I would completely agree there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Awesome. Should we do SQL Family?
Sounds good to me.
So, Greg, how did you first get started with SQL Server?
I joke because when I was in college, I took a class on databases. It discussed the SQL language and how this is starting to become more popular, and maybe someday it'll be a force in the industry. And probably within about 10 years, I had a client that did a information management system for laboratories. And they started moving from using Informix, for anybody who remembers that, now I'm dating myself, over to SQL Server. And what they needed was their team could install their software, but they wanted someone to know how to ask the question. And what they needed was their team could install their software, but they wanted someone to go in a day or two beforehand and install the SQL Server setup and everything like that. So I kind of became their go-to person for that. And after that, moved into a internet startup in 1998 where I became the DBA and stuff like that. And just really decided I really enjoy it. I love the fact that, there's so much data at fingertips and you just know how to ask the questions. You can get some amazing stuff out of databases.
Yep. All right. Very cool.
If there's one thing you could change about SQL Server, what would it be?
It's funny. I just answered this question on Quora.com. One of my beefs, and it's a small one, but I'm sure every DBA has gotten bit by it once, is the fact that when you do restore database, it defaults to with recovery. And if you forget to type with no recovery, restore the logs and discover, oof, I can't. You're going to say, I wish I'd typed no recovery. So I really wish no recovery was the default, because worst case is if you got nothing else to do, you just then say with recovery and you're done.
Yeah, there you go.
What is the best piece of career advice that you've received?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know what the best piece I received. The best I can give is do what you enjoy, not what you love. Because if you do what you love for a job, it becomes a job and you stop loving it. But if you do what you enjoy, you'll probably still enjoy it while working.
Okay.
There you go. Our last question for you today, Greg. If you could have one superhero power, what would it be and why do you want it?
I go back and forth between teleportation and flying. I think being able to fly and like a bird and swoop and soar and all that would be pretty darn cool.
Yeah.
You
must still have hair.
Reason for wanting a superpower.
Hey, well, there you go.
All right.
Yes, I was going to say you must still have hair that the wind can flow through, right?
And I do. I just got it trimmed last week, so it'd be pretty short. But I'll grow it out if I ever get the chance to fly.
Well, Well, awesome. Well, Greg, thanks so much for being on the program. We do appreciate it.
I enjoy it. Thanks for having me. And if you ever want to talk about plane crashes in the future, we can do another one on that.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
So I went ahead and took Greg's challenge here and went to the FEMA website, and I found this ICS course that he talked about. And while I admit I didn't get through all of it, I did begin the course, and it won't take too long. I just need to spend a little bit more time with it. But I did find it interesting that this was created, and, kind of looking back to the origin of FEMA and some of these things, is the California wildfires in the 70s. And they just got bigger and bigger, and with more homes and people dying as a result of these fires, the government decided to put together kind of a plan of action, or at least some ideas or a framework on how first responders and emergency personnel could get together and coordinate ideas. And so I do think it harkens a lot to some of the thoughts that Greg had in today's episode. And so, of course, we'll have the link to that course up on the website if you're interested in checking it out. It's, I think we in technology get a little bit spoiled with some of the interactivity that we have. Now, there are some videos and whatnot that are in the course, but for the most part, going to be PowerPoint types or slides that you're going to go through and do a bit of reading on. But again, very interesting. I think one of these ideas is from a culture perspective, right? So this is not necessarily technology driven, but how can we change the culture around disasters? I was actually at an event last night talking with folks, and these are general IT people, but there's always that questioner in the back of my mind is, if I make this change, am I going to break something, right? Is it going to cause an issue? And then what are the repercussions there? And so I think part of this idea is that we can move forward if we know how we're going to interact when emergencies do come. And so thanks to Greg for that conversation. As always, compañeros, we're interested in your thoughts on what we should be talking about on the podcast, or if you'd like to join us, of course, we're very interested in that. So, compañeros, you can always reach out to us on social media. I am interested in connecting with you on LinkedIn. I am at Carlos L. Chacon. And, compañeros, I'll see you on the SQL Trail.